feel like, um, the bill of goods that I was sold was that I was educated 0% on what it would do. I was told clear skin, bigger boobs, and when you're however old I was, which I will not say, you're like, "Yes, whatever." Like, and it was
Yes.
kind of like it was interesting because from a social perspective, it was kind of like a rite of passage almost, where it was kind of a cool socialized thing within women in high school, where it was like, had to have my alarm to take my birth control, and it felt like a cool part of growing up for some reason. But for the people and for women that are younger in their teens and in high school that are being put on birth control, what is happening to their brain
That's
or
the
just them in general?
I mean, that's like the $8 million question, right? So if you give hormonal birth control to a grown-up, and for just the purposes of this conversation, we're gonna define a grown-up as somebody who's 20 years or older. Okay, because once you're 20, your most of your brain development is done, right? So it's not all done, but it's mostly done. And when you give birth control to a grown-up woman, what you're doing is you're shutting down her ovaries, right? So her ovaries aren't maturing an egg follicle, which is what's responsible for the release of estrogen. And it's not releasing an egg and then creating this empty egg follicle, which is what releases
Mm.
progesterone. So essentially, what you're doing is shutting down the ovaries so they don't produce estrogen or progesterone. And instead, you're supplanting that with these synthetic hormones, right? So every day you take this pill, it gives you this dose of these synthetics, and that keeps your own ovaries from producing your own levels of sex hormones, right? And when you do this with an adult woman, it means that it's going to change the hormonal message that her brain is receiving, right? So we know from research, for example, that if you give an adult woman hormonal birth control, that it's associated with increased risk of sexual dysfunction, right? And that's presumably because of this synthetic hormonal milieu that's created by these pills, right? Which keeps estrogen levels really low. It keeps testosterone levels really low.
Mm.
And it has this relatively high dose of these synthetic progestins. And all of these things are bad for sexual desire. And so we see things like that, for example. So all of these are, when we're giving it to adults, what we're seeing is how do these hormones that we're giving women that they're experiencing and that their brain is sort of reading, how does this
Mhm.
influence the way that they think and feel and experience the world? And we can kind of go through the range of effects that you get with that in just a moment. But when we're talking about young girls, and here we'll just define young girls as 19 and younger, you still have a lot of brain development that's going on. And when you are experiencing post pubertal brain development, which is all the developmental changes that go on in your brain that sort of mold it and take it from its like child version of
Mhm.
itself and turns it into a grown up brain, all of that remodeling that goes on after puberty in terms of leading to brain development is something that's coordinated by your sex hormones. Okay. And so during this period, if you're taking these synthetic hormones, we don't know what that's doing to brain development. And thus far, there have been very, very few studies. I can count them on two hands, the number of studies that have been done looking at the effects of hormonal birth control pill use during adolescence. So again, during this period after,
Mhm.
puberty up until about 20, on brain development and then long-term developmental effects. But the research that has been done is beginning to point fingers at a possible link between adolescent birth control pill use and then a greater risk of developing major depressive disorder across your lifetime, even after you're off of hormonal birth control. And that's pretty
Wow.
scary.
And depressive disorder would be periods in time where you have depressive spells, but not clinical depression.
No, clinical depression.
Okay, got
So,
it.
yeah, so, when we're talking about, the research looking at, the developmental effects of taking hormonal birth control when you're still in adolescence, so again, usually between ages 12 to 19 is how we define that. What you find is that, women who take it or girls who take it during that time, throughout adulthood, they're at an increased risk of developing, yeah, major depressive disorder, so clinical depression.
Wow. This is very rudimentary, but it's like, so the body is looking via the brain to create, or what is it, to develop with the hormones that are in the body for
Mhm.
a woman or a girl, a young girl, as defined earlier.
Mhm.
And so because the body's not naturally producing the estrogen and progesterone,
Mhm.
then it's taking the synthetic essentially and probably making the parts of the brain with the synthetic.
Yeah, so it's using that's where it's getting its hormonal message. It's getting, like, a
Whoa.
totally different hormonal message than what girls generally get during development, and so my guess is, because, when you look at what, the synthetic hormones are that are in birth control pills, what you have is you have a relatively low dose of estrogen, right? So, low levels of that, and then a relatively high level of synthetic progesterone, which is called a progestin. And so you get, there's sort of 2 things going on. One, you're getting a constant hormonal message every day, right? So you take that pill every day, it's sending the same message to your brain and every other part of your body that reads hormones, right? And this is different than a naturally cycling girl who goes through periods of the first half of the cycle, estrogen is relatively high and progesterone is very low, and then during the second half of the cycle, you get a reverse where you get relatively high levels of progesterone and then relatively low levels of estrogen. And so for a naturally cycling girl who's developing and going through and her brain is developing, her body is learning to adjust to these waxing and waning of these two, really important female sex hormones, and then, sort of adjusting development in a way that helps to regulate the cycle, regulate the reproductive tract, and then also to shape other parts of the brain that are influenced by hormones. And when we take a girl who's on the synthetic and they're getting the same hormonal message every day, not only is the brain not learning how to adapt to these dynamic hormonal changes, right? We don't know what that hormonal message, like getting that
Yeah.
same hormonal message every day, like what that's doing in terms of brain development. And there's just like a big question mark on this. And it's only very recently that researchers and physicians and advocates for women have really started to push for, hey, like, don't you think it might be kind of a good idea to like know what this does to brain
Mhm.
development if we're going to be putting 13-year-old girls on it for acne?
Mhm.
I mean, and yeah, so to me, this is a case where I think we need to be very cautious with adolescent birth control
Mhm.
pill use just because we don't know. I mean, but there's every reason to believe that it's going to influence brain development. We just don't know in what ways and to what degree it matters. And I'm defining matters just in terms
Mhm.
of like, does that actually influence, any sort of development, like any sort of outcome, life outcome that girls who have used hormonal birth control during adolescence versus those who did not, like any type of life outcomes that those two groups might have.
Mm. Thank you so much for tuning in to Morning Microdose by Almost 30.
We hope you enjoyed waking up.
As always, we encourage you to take what resonates and leave the rest. If you enjoyed this trip, tune into the full episode on the Almost 30 podcast. All episode information can be found in the show notes.
Make sure to subscribe, and if this becomes a part of your morning routine, be sure to share it with a friend. We have new inspiring doses Monday through Friday. Follow us on Instagram at Morning Microdose, and follow Almost 30 at Almost 30 Podcast.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the vortex.